Earth severs all ties with the Galactic Council, leaving the entire universe in panic. Part 1: The Last Straw. The room was cold. Not the kind of cold that came from a broken heater or an open window. It was the kind of cold that came from silence, from the weight of too many important words being held back for too long. Colonel Diane Hartley sat at a long, white table in the center of the Galactic Council's grand chamber on Verantos Prime. The ceiling of the room was so high it disappeared into the shadow. The walls were covered in the flags and symbols of over 300 civilizations. Somewhere behind her, Pete Calloway sat quietly with a notebook open on his knee, his pen not moving. Hartley had been in difficult rooms before. She had negotiated in basements, in orbit, in rooms that smelled like engine fuel and bad coffee. She had talked her way out of situations that should have ended careers or started wars. But this room was different. This room had the kind of quiet that told you something had already been decided before you walked in. The voice of Seven Sons sat across from her. It was not a being that made a strong impression at first glance. It was tall and pale, with a face that seemed too still, like a photograph of something alive. It had served as the grand arbiter of the Galactic Council for longer than most human civilizations had existed. It had seen empires rise and collapse. It had watched species reach the stars and then forget how they got there. It looked at Diane Hartley with the kind of patience that was not really patience at all. It was indifference wearing patience as a coat. The chamber was full. Delegates from dozens of species filled the curved rows of seats that rose on both sides of the table. Some of them had traveled for weeks to be here. Some of them had never seen a human being in person before. They watched Hartley with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something closer to pity. The voice of Seven Sons began speaking. Its voice was smooth and perfectly translated by the device clipped behind Hartley's ear. It explained slowly and carefully that the Galactic Council had completed its review of Earth's application for a permanent voting seat. It explained that the Council had, after careful deliberation, passed Resolution 9 Alpha. It explained what Resolution 9 Alpha meant. It meant that Earth's provisional voting seat was being removed. The reason, the voice continued, was that humanity had failed to meet the Council's requirements for civilizational standardization. Earth still maintained individual nation-states. It still had competing governments, competing laws, competing armies. The Council's model required a single, unified government, a single point of contact, a single voice speaking for the whole species. Humanity had not achieved this. Therefore, humanity was not ready. Hartley listened. She did not move. She did not interrupt. She had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room full of people who expected a reaction was to give them nothing. When the voice of Seven Sons finished speaking, the chamber was quiet again. A delegate somewhere to the left shifted in his seat. Someone coughed. Behind Hartley, she could hear Calloway's pen touch the page and then stop. The voice of Seven Sons asked politely whether Earth's representative wished to respond to the resolution before it was formally entered into the record. Hartley reached into the case on the table beside her. She pulled out a single sealed document. flat and plain, with no decoration on it, except for the official seal of the United Earth Defense Secretariat. She placed it on the table and slid it across to the center, where a council aide picked it up with both hands and carried it to the arbiter. The voice of Seven Sons opened it. It read slowly. For the first time since Hartley had entered the room, something moved in its expression. Not alarm, not fear, something more like the very beginning of alarm, the moment just before a person realizes what they are looking at. The document was not a counter-proposal. It was not a request for reconsideration. It was not a formal complaint or a call for a second vote. It was a notice of full and permanent withdrawal. Hartley stood up. She straightened her jacket, the dark blue one with the small Earth insignia on the left shoulder. She looked at the voice of Seven Sons. For a moment, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the steady look of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and was now simply completing the last step of it. She told the chamber that Earth thanked the Galactic Council for the years of conversation. She said that her government had reviewed the terms of council membership carefully and had concluded that the arrangement was no longer in Earth's interest. She said that the document on the table formalized the conclusion and that Earth would be closing all joint communication relays within 72 hours. Then she picked up her case, turned, and walked toward the door. There was a sound in the chamber then. It was not one sound, but many small sounds at once, the shift of hundreds of bodies, the rustle of translation devices adjusting, the low murmur of voices that had not expected to be surprised today and did not quite know what to do with the feeling. Calloway fell into step beside her. He was 29 years old. He had grown up in a small town in Kentucky where the big news each week was whether the grain prices had gone up or down. He had never expected to be standing in the grandest diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy at the moment it stopped being able to predict what would happen next. He kept his face very still, the way Hartley had taught him, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that was trying very hard not to become a smile. They walked down the long corridor, outside the chamber, past the tall windows that looked out over the city of Varanthos Prime, all pale towers and endless sky. Their footsteps were the only sound. When they were far enough from the chamber doors, Calloway finally spoke. He asked quietly if that had gone the way she expected. Hartley thought about it for a moment. She said it had gone exactly the way she expected because she had not expected anything. She had simply done what the situation required. Calloway nodded. He asked what happened next. Hartley looked out through one of the tall windows at the alien sky. It was a pale orange color with two small moons visible even in daylight. It was beautiful in the way that completely foreign things can be. Beautiful, impressive, but not home. She said that what happened next was not her department anymore. She said that other people had spent 20 years building what came next, and now it was their turn. They kept walking. Behind them, in the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, 300 years of assumptions about humanity were sitting very quietly at a long white table, trying to figure out what had just happened. End of Part 1. Earth severs all ties with the Galactic Council, leaving the entire universe in panic. Part 2, the silence that speaks. The first sign that something was wrong came through a routine trade. Confirmation line between the Zorati Commercial Bureau and Earth's Orbital Coordination Office. At exactly 6:00 in the morning, Greenwich time, the line went silent. The Zorati operator sent 3 follow-up signals. None of them received a response. She filed a report. Her supervisor read it, shrugged, and told her to try again in an hour. An hour later, the line was still silent. So were 12 others. By afternoon, every communication channel that ran between Earth and the Galactic Council's relay network had gone completely dark. Not damaged, not jammed, not rerouted. Simply closed. The relays were still functioning. Earth had shut its own side of every door quietly and at the same time, like a house going dark room by room. In the council chamber on Varanthus Prime, the news arrived slowly at first. And then all at once. A junior aide brought a data tablet to the senior communications officer. The senior communications officer brought it to the deputy arbiter. The deputy arbiter carried it into the main hall and placed it on the table in front of the voice of Seven Sons, who was in the middle of reviewing a completely unrelated trade dispute between 2 minor species in the outer sectors. The voice of Seven Sons read the report. Then it read it again. Then it sat very still for a long time. Earth had not sent a message explaining what it was doing. Earth had not issued a formal statement. Earth had not threatened, demanded, or complained. Earth had simply closed everything all at once with no fanfare and no noise. 72 hours after Colonel Hartley had walked out of the council chamber, Protocol 0 was complete. The council called an emergency session. The chamber filled faster than anyone had seen it fill in decades. Delegates who had been in transit back to their home systems turned their ships around. Representatives who had been asleep at odd hours were woken up and told to get to the nearest communication terminal immediately. Within 6 hours, every seat in the chamber was occupied. The mood was hard to describe. It was not panic, not yet. It was more like the feeling of reaching for something that had always been in the same place and finding empty space where it used to be. The Zorati delegate spoke first. Their empire covered a large section of the Migram systems and had built much of its industrial output around human processed quantum fuel cells over the last 40 years. The cells were more reliable than anything the Zorati produced themselves, and the price had always been fair. The Zorati chief delegate stood and explained in a voice that was trying very hard to stay calm that without those fuel cells, approximately 1/3 of their active manufacturing infrastructure would have to be shut down within 18 months. He asked the council what the plan was. The council did not have a plan. The Helvari Confederation sent 3 separate envoys to Earth's orbital perimeter within the first 48 hours. The first 2 were turned away by automated systems. The third received a recorded message, polite and short, stating that Earth was not currently accepting diplomatic contact and that any future communication requests would be reviewed in the order they were received. The message did not say when that review would happen. It did not give a timeline. It did not offer any indication of what Earth wanted or what it would take for things to go back to the way they had been. That silence was harder to deal with than any threat would have been. A threat could be answered. A demand could be negotiated. Silence gave you nothing to push against. The Council's own intelligence team had been scrambled the moment the relays went dark. Their best analysts were pulled from other assignments and set to work on a single question: how bad was this really? Within 36 hours, the lead analyst, being named Orith 7, who had spent 4 decades studying human civilization, had a preliminary report ready. He delivered it in person, which was unusual. He stood at the front of the chamber and spoke without notes. He told the Council that the situation was considerably more serious than most of them had assumed. He explained that his team had spent the last day and a half going back through years of data, shipping records, construction manifests, resource allocations, and trade logs. What they had found was not a sudden act of rebellion. What they had found was a plan. For at least 22 years, he said, Earth had been building a second infrastructure in parallel with the one it shared with the Council. Independent, faster-than-light lanes that did not pass through any Council-monitored corridor. Manufacturing chains that sourced materials from locations not listed in any joint agreement. A fleet of vessels that had never been registered with Council-approved shipyards and therefore had never appeared in any shared database. 11 bilateral trade agreements with species that were not members of the Council, several of which had been quietly upgraded and expanded in the last 3 years. Someone in the chamber asked how that was possible. How had they missed it? Orith 7 said they had missed it because they had not been looking. He said, and he chose his words carefully, that the Council had consistently assessed humanity as a developing civilization in need of guidance. That assessment had created a certain way of looking at human activity. When humans built things, the Council had assumed those things were for the Council's benefit or were subject to Council oversight. No one had seriously considered the possibility that humans were building something the Council was never meant to see. The room was quiet after that. A delegate from the Vaden Assembly, who had been among the loudest voices in support of Resolution 9 Alpha, sat in the back row and said nothing for a very long time. The Vaden had built their political reputation on the idea that humanity was manageable, predictable, and ultimately dependent on the stability that Council membership provided. That argument had just become much harder to make. Orith 7 finished his report and stood waiting for questions. There were many questions, but most of them circled around the same central point without quite landing on it. Finally, a small delegate from one of the outer rim civilizations raised her hand and asked the question everyone else had been avoiding. She asked whether Earth actually needed the Council at all. Orith 7 took a breath. He said that based on what his team had found, the honest answer was that Earth had not needed the Council for quite some time. The Council, he said, had been useful to Earth once. That time appeared to have passed. The chamber was silent after that. Outside the tall windows of the Council building, the city of Aranthos Prime went on as normal. Ships moved through the sky. Lights came on as the sun set. 3,000 years of civilization proceeded exactly as it always had. But inside the chamber something had shifted. A certainty that had been in the room for as long as anyone could remember, had quietly packed its things and left, and everyone present was only just beginning to understand that it was not coming back. End of Part 2, where Earth severs all ties with the Galactic Council, leaving the entire universe in panic. Part 3, the weight of what was built. The facility did not look like much from the outside. It sat beneath several hundred feet of rock in the Colorado mountains, accessed by a single road that most maps did not show. The entrance was a plain metal door with a keypad and a camera. There was no sign. There was no flag. There were no guards standing outside, because people who knew what was inside did not need guards, and people who did not know what was inside had no reason to stop. Carl Bishop had worked in this facility for 11 years. He was 54 years old, short, with gray at his temples and the kind of calm in his face that comes not from peace but from having thought through every bad scenario so many times that none of them surprised him anymore. He had started his career as a Navy engineer, spent 15 years designing propulsion systems for deep space vessels, and then been quietly asked to take a different job, a job that did not have a title on any official document, a job that consisted, for the most part, of making sure that a plan nobody was supposed to know about kept moving forward on schedule. He was sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of incoming reports when Protocol Zero entered its final phase. He read each report as it came in, made a small check mark in the corner, and set it aside. His expression did not change. This was not because he did not feel anything. It was because he had been preparing for this day for a very long time, and people who prepare that carefully do not feel surprised when the thing they prepared for finally happens. They feel something quieter, something closer to completion. The reports told him that 31 deep space stations were now fully operational. These were not small outposts. They were serious facilities built over 2 decades in locations that did not appear on any council-approved star chart. They had their own power generation, their own food production systems, their own manufacturing capacity. Each one could support a crew of several hundred for years without resupply from Earth if it had to. Most of them had never been resupplied from Earth. They had been resupplying each other. The fleet reports came in next. Bishop read them carefully. The vessels were of a type the Council had never seen because they had been designed and built in shipyards that existed outside Council-monitored space. The Council's transparency agreements covered vessels registered at approved facilities. These vessels had never been registered anywhere. They were not violations of any agreement. They were simply outside the agreement entirely, the way that a conversation held in a language no one else speaks is not a secret, it is just a conversation. There were also the trade agreements, 11 of them formally signed with species that the Council had always treated as minor and unimportant, small civilizations on the edges of known space with limited territory and limited political weight in the Council chamber. Earth had been talking to them quietly for years, not about politics, about useful things, resources, technology, navigation data, manufacturing techniques. The agreements were simple and fair, which was unusual enough to be noticed by the species who received them. Several of those species had come back to Earth more than once to expand the arrangement. Bishop finished his coffee and started on a second cup when his phone rang. It was Senator Laura Voss calling from Washington. She was the chair of the Interstellar Affairs Committee and one of the small number of elected officials who had been briefed on Protocol Zero from the beginning. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the question in it before she asked it. She asked him plainly whether he was scared. Bishop thought about it. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, turning it over and looking at it from different angles. Then he said he was not scared. He said he was relieved. He explained that for 30 years humanity had been building two things at the same time. They had built everything the Council asked them to build, all the joint stations and shared relays and approved trade lanes, and they had also built everything they actually needed. Now, he said, they only had to carry one of those things. The weight had been cut in half overnight. There was a pause on the line. Then Voss laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, the kind that comes when something you have been worried about suddenly sounds manageable. Then she thanked him and said she had calls to make. Bishop went back to his reports. Outside the facility, the world was not quite as calm. The news of Earth's withdrawal had reached the public through official channels exactly 12 hours after Protocol Zero was complete. The announcement was simple, factual, and short. It said that Earth had ended its membership in the Galactic Council and was now operating as a fully independent civilization. It said that existing bilateral trade agreements with non-council species would continue. It said that Earth wished all other civilizations well. The reaction was not panic. It was something more complicated than panic. People had questions, and the answers too. Most of those questions were versions of the same basic message. Earth had planned for this. Earth was ready, and things were going to be different, but they were not going to be worse. Most people, once they heard that, went back to their lives. They had work to do. They had families. The sky outside their windows looked the same as it always had. But further out, in the spaces between stars, things were moving. A fleet of merchant vessels from the Crethian free ports had been watching Earth's situation from a careful distance for several years. The Crethians were a practical people who had spent generations being squeezed by council trade regulations that always seemed designed to benefit larger civilizations at the expense of smaller ones. When Earth had first approached them 6 years earlier with a simple and fair offer, they had been suspicious. When the offer turned out to be exactly what it looked like, they had been surprised. When Earth had come back 2 years later with an expanded proposal, they had said yes before the meeting was over. Now a Crethian merchant convoy of 9 ships arrived near Earth's outer orbital marker. They did not send a formal diplomatic message. They sent a short, practical transmission that said they had cargo that Earth might find useful and asked if the trade corridor was still open. Earth's response came back in 4 minutes. Yes, the corridor was open. The standard terms applied. Welcome. The transaction that followed took 6 hours from first contact to completed transfer. Both sides had done this before, and both sides knew what they were doing. There was no ceremony and no celebration. There did not need to be. The work was the celebration. Bishop read the trade confirmation report when it landed on his desk. He made a check mark in the corner and said it with the others. Outside his window, deep beneath the mountains, there was nothing to see. Just rock and fluorescent light and the quiet hum of systems doing exactly what they had been built to do. He thought about what Voss had asked him, whether he was scared. He thought about the 22 years of work that had gone into getting to this morning. The engineers who had built stations in the dark, the captains who had flown routes that appeared on no official chart, the diplomats who had sat across from small and overlooked civilizations and treated them with the same respect they would have given anyone, not because it was good politics, but because it was the right way to talk to people. He thought about all of that, and then he picked up the next report and kept reading. End of Part 3. Earth severs all ties with the Galactic Council, leaving the entire universe in panic. Part 4. The Council's gamble. The vote was the most unusual in 3,000 years of Council history. Not because of the result, although the result was surprising. It was unusual because of what the vote was for. The Galactic Council, for the first time in its entire existence, was voting to send a delegation to a non-member civilization, not to offer membership, not to deliver a warning, to ask for terms. The debate before the vote lasted 9 hours. There were delegates who argued that this was unnecessary, that Earth would come back eventually, that independent civilizations always came back to the Council because the galaxy was too large and too complicated to navigate alone. There were other delegates, fewer in number but harder to dismiss, who had read or A7's report very carefully and were no longer confident in that assumption. The economic data was difficult to ignore. 14 Council member civilizations were already showing signs of supply chain stress. The Zorati manufacturing projections had worsened since the first report. The Council's own internal research stations, several of which had relied on human data processing contracts, were running behind schedule. None of this was catastrophic yet, but the word yet was doing a lot of work. In those conversations, the vote passed by a margin that surprised the losing side. 71% in favor of sending a formal delegation to Earth. The conditions were clear. The delegation was not going to arrive with demands. It was going to arrive with a question. The question was, what would it take for any future relationship to exist at all, on whatever terms Earth was willing to consider. Finding a suitable location for the meeting took 2 weeks. Earth declined to host it. The Council's own chamber was out of the question. Eventually, both sides agreed on a small, independent station in unclaimed space, a modest waypoint facility run by a species called the Neth, who had no strong relationship with either party, and whose main business was providing fuel and lodging to passing ships. The Neth were pleased to host. They quietly doubled their food inventory and hired 2 extra kitchen staff. Colonel Hartley got the call on a Tuesday morning. She was at home in Maine, standing on her back porch with a mug of tea, looking at the water. Calloway called her directly, which told her the call was personal, not official. He told her that the Secretary General's office had asked for her specifically. He said there was nobody else they Wanted in that chair. Hartley was quiet for a moment. She asked Calloway if he was going. He said he assumed so if she was going. She told him to pack for cold weather. The Neth station ran its temperature low. Calloway, who was now a full colonel and had spent the last 3 years helping coordinate Earth's independent trade network, allowed himself exactly 1 second of visible relief before he said yes and ended the call. The meeting began on a gray morning. Station time. The council's delegation was led by Under-Arbiter Selene Voth, a being who was notably younger than the voice of 7 sons and who had, over the past several months, become associated council circles with the faction that believed the previous approach to humanity had been a mistake. She arrived with 4 advisors and a data case. She shook Hartley's hand in the human manner which she had clearly practiced. They sat across from each other at a plain table in a plain room. The Neth had provided water and a tray of food that neither side recognized, but both sides politely tried. Outside the single window, the stars were very still. Selene Voth opened the meeting. She said that the council had reviewed its handling of Resolution 9 Alpha and had concluded that it had been a miscalculation. She did not say it was wrong. She said it was a miscalculation. Hartley noted the word choice and said nothing. Selene Voth then said that the council was prepared to recognize Earth as a fully sovereign, independent entity and to open discussions about what, if any, form of structured relationship the 2 parties might share going forward. She said the council was not asking Earth to rejoin. She said the council was asking Earth what it wanted. Hartley reached into her case. She pulled out a document and placed it on the table. It was thicker than the one she had placed on the table in the council chamber 3 years earlier. She slid it across. Selene Voth opened it. She began reading. After the first few pages, she stopped and looked up. Hartley explained calmly that the document was a complete framework for a new kind of relationship between Earth and any other civilization that wished to engage with it. It was not a membership agreement. It was not a partnership. It was not an alliance. It was a set of clearly defined, fully optional trade and communication protocols, each one specific and limited, each one renewable every 10 years by a vote of Earth's own citizens. Any civilization could request access to any protocol. Earth would review the request. Earth would decide. Selene Voth read further. She came to the section on governance. Oversight. There was no section on governance. Oversight. She came to the section on civilizational standardization. Requirements. There was no such section. She came to the section on council. Arbitration rights. There was no such section either. She asked Hartley if Earth intended to operate entirely outside any shared legal framework. Hartley said that Earth intended to operate within Earth's legal framework, and that any civilization engaging with Earth would be doing so under agreements they had freely chosen, which were governed by terms they had read before signing. She said that if that sounded simple, it was because it was meant to be simple. Selene Voth asked the question that her advisors had told her not to ask, the one that had no good answer, but that she felt she had to ask anyway. She asked why humans were so determined to stay outside when inside offered so much more protection. Hartley looked at her. not unkindly. She said that humans had read their history with great care. She said that every time in human history that a group of people had handed someone else the power to decide their future, they had eventually regretted it. She said that Earth was not looking for a ceiling, even a very comfortable one. She said that the Council's protection had always come with the Council's control, and that Earth had decided some time ago that it did not need the second thing badly enough to accept the first thing along with it. She thanked Voth for making the journey. She said she hoped the document would be useful. She said Earth looked forward to hearing the Council's response in whatever time they needed. Then she picked up her case and waited. End of Part 4 of Severs all ties with the Galactic Council, leaving the entire universe in panic. Part 5, A New Map of the Stars. 3 years later, the galactic map looked different. Not dramatically different. From a distance, it still looked like the same old arrangement of stars and systems and the thin lines of trade routes connecting them. But if you looked more carefully, if you knew what you were looking at, you could see that some of the lines had moved. Some of the old routes were thinner now, less trafficked, carrying less weight than they used to. And there were new lines running in directions that had not been mapped before, connecting points that nobody had bothered to connect in 3,000 years of Council oversight. The Council had not collapsed. It was still there, still holding sessions, still passing resolutions. But 6 of its smaller member civilizations had quietly opened bilateral talks with Earth in the past 18 months. They had not left the Council, not yet. But they were learning what it felt like to negotiate a deal without someone larger sitting at the head of the table, deciding what fair looked like. The voting assembly had issued 3 separate public statements condemning what they called Earth's destabilizing influence on galactic order. They had also sent a private message to Carl Bishop's office through an intermediary, asking whether Earth might be open to a preliminary conversation about the possibility of an informal communications framework at some future point. The message was careful to note that this was entirely hypothetical and should not be interpreted as an expression of interest. Bishop had read it twice, made a check mark in the corner, and filed it in the folder he kept for things that would matter later. Pete Calloway was on a supply run. His ship, a mid-size cargo vessel called the Steadfast Carry, had been traveling for 4 days from Earth's outer station network toward a small waypoint called Junction 7, which was run by the Crethian Free Ports. It was not a glamorous assignment. The cargo hold was full of processed materials and medical equipment. The crew was 11 people. The most exciting thing that had happened in the last 4 days was that the coffee machine on Deck 2 had started making a strange sound, and 2 crew members had spent an entire afternoon arguing about whether it needed to be replaced or just recalibrated. Calloway liked these runs. He had done enough dramatic things in his career. He had stood in the Council's grand chamber. He had helped negotiate the terms of 3 bilateral agreements. He had been in the room when Protocol 0 was completed and watched the largest plan withdrawal in interstellar diplomatic history execute itself calmly and on schedule. After all of that, a quiet supply run through friendly space with a crew of 11 and a broken coffee machine felt like something close to peace. Junction 7 came into view on the forward screen. It was a modest station, nothing impressive from the outside, a central hub with 4 docking arms and a rotating section for gravity. But it was busy. That was the thing about Junction 7 that you did not expect until you arrived. It was always busy. Calloway watched through the screen as his ship came into dock. On the arm across from him, a Crethian merchant freighter was offloading cargo into the station's main bay. On the arm below, a small vessel he did not immediately recognize was receiving a fuel delivery from the station supply lines. He looked up its registration on the ship's database. It was from a civilization called the Velhari, a small species from the edge of the map region who had signed an optional trade protocol with Earth about 8 months ago. He had never met a Velhari before. Most humans hadn't. Inside the station, it was warm and loud, in the way that busy places always are. The main trading floor was a wide open space with stalls along the walls and tables in the center, and at any given moment there were beings from at least 6 different species talking, arguing, pointing at things and working out arrangements on whatever materials happened to be available. He saw 2 representatives from different civilizations who had clearly just met each other working through translation device that was only partially cooperating, both of them drawing pictures on a shared piece of paper to get the point across. He found a corner table and ordered something hot. The station's kitchen staff, which included 2 Crethians and a human named Greg who had been stationed there for 2 years, produced something that was technically coffee and mostly worked. Calloway wrapped both hands around the cup and watched the room. This was what the new arrangement looked like from the inside. Not a council chamber with 300 seats and a voice that had been making decisions for 3,000 years. A warm room with mismatched chairs and a coffee machine that might need to be recalibrated, full of people from different worlds who were trying to figure out what they needed and whether the person across the table had it. It was messy. It was slow. Half the conversations going on around him would probably not result in any agreement at all. But the ones that did would be real agreements made between people who had chosen to be there on terms they had both read before sitting down. Calloway thought about something Hartley had said to him once early in his career, when he had asked her what the point of all of it was. All the preparation, all the secrecy, all the years of building something that could not be talked about openly. She had told him that the point was simple. The point was that humanity had spent long enough asking permission to be what it already was. The work was just the process of stopping. He finished his coffee. He nodded at Greg across the room who was arguing cheerfully with a Crethian merchant about the correct price for a container of something orange and crystalline that neither of them could quite agree on a name for. Greg caught his eye and waved without interrupting the argument. Calloway stepped outside onto the station's observation deck. It was a small space with a clear panel looking out into open space. The stars out here were different from the stars over Earth, slightly different arrangements, slightly different colors, but the same ancient light that had been traveling for millions of years to reach whatever I happened to be looking. He stood there for a while. He thought about Carl Bishop and his facility under the mountains. He thought about Senator Voss and her surprised laugh. He thought about Hartley on her back porch in Maine looking at the water. He thought about the 11 ships in Earth's new network that were currently in transit between stations carrying cargo and messages and people between worlds that had never been connected before. Back on Earth that same evening, Bishop stood on a balcony outside his apartment, looking at a clear night sky. Voss called him. They talked about the latest network numbers, the new Velhari protocol, the private message from the Viadine. Then there was a pause and Voss asked him if he thought they had done the right thing. Bishop looked up at the stars. He took his time. He said that he thought the right thing was simply what they were always going to do. He said that human beings have been reaching toward that sky for as long as there had been human beings, and that the only question had ever been whether they would keep asking someone else's permission to keep going. He said that they had answered the question now, and the answer was in the ships and the stations and the quiet agreements made in warm rooms between people who had decided to talk to each other without anyone at the head of the table telling them how. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said good night. Bishop stayed on the balcony a little longer. The stars did not care about the Galactic Council. They did not care about resolutions or provisional membership or civilizational standardization requirements. They had been there long before any of that, and they would be there long after. They were simply there, the same as they had always been, patient and bright and completely indifferent to anything except the fact of their own burning light. He looked at them for a while. Then he went inside.